Good evening. My name is Barbara Grosh. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester Metropolitan District. And I'd like to welcome you all to our candidates forum tonight for Assembly District 135. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We don't endorse either candidates or parties. But we do think an informed electorate is what keeps democracy working, and we appreciate very much the candidates who are willing to come and debate together so that voters can assess them. I have one announcement to make, a small change in plans, which is that we will not be able to have District 130 present with us tonight. We thought we would. Brian Mantello, candidate in the 130th, informed us at 5 p.m. that he isn't going to be able to make the forum tonight as something has come up. League policy prohibits having a candidate event with only one candidate for an office present. So this required us to eliminate AD 130 from the forum. We notified Scott Comegys, and he said that he appreciated the fairness we insist on in our candidate events. This forum will be recorded. The link will be sent to all the attendees within a few days, and it will be posted to our website. There is closed captioning available. You can find it if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says live transcript with that little CC icon. And with no more ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Tyrese Bryant, who will explain the rules for us. Thank you, Tyrese.
Thank you so much. So the League of Women Voters has prepared questions to ask the candidates tonight, but we'll like to get questions from you as well, everyone watching and listening. So if you have any questions you'll like the candidates to answer tonight, please put them in the Q&A on Zoom that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. After I think about 3 years of Zoom, I think we know how Zoom works. So drop those questions in anytime during the forum, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. All questions will be asked of all candidates. So now it's time to meet our candidates in the order that they'll be speaking, and they'll be coming on camera at the same time. So our first candidate for AD 135 is going to be Mr. Joe Chanelli. He's a Fairport native, a Marine Corps combat veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and presently the National Executive Director of American Veterans, better known as AMVETS. Joe has spent the past 20 years working in the nonprofit community, working to ensure our government keeps its promises, striving to improve everyone's quality of life, especially those in need. Our second candidate is the incumbent, Jen Lunsford. She's a mom, a lawyer, and the current representative of the 135th District in the New York State Assembly. Jen lives in Parenton with her husband, Scott, and her first grade son, Mackie. And allow me to just switch out. Okay, now it is time for our timekeeper this evening is going to be Tess McFarland Porter. She'll hold up cards to let the candidates know how much time they have left and when their time is up. The first candidate to answer a question has 1.5 minutes. The second candidate will have 1 minute to answer the question, and we'll switch as we go through questions and who leads off our questions. So now it's time to meet our candidates. They both will have 1 minute opening statements. So we'll start with Joe Chanelli.
Good evening. Thank you, Tyrese. Thank you to the League and for everyone who's come tonight. In many important ways, New York State's headed in the wrong direction. So the only logical way forward is to change direction. I'm offering a direction that will restore public safety, a direction that will meaningfully address inflation, a direction that empowers our local levels of government, a direction that will provide opportunity for our young people so they want to and can afford to raise their families here. The current direction has led to record violent crime, a disgustingly high number of children living in poverty, children being gunned down in the streets of Rochester. When I look at my 5 children, I want to make our community a better, safer place for them and for you. I spent my adult life fighting for others. I've proven over the past 20 years that I'm a highly effective advocate. Up to this point, my constituents have been my fellow military veterans. Now I want to work for you, fight for you, no matter your political party. I'm your tough on crime candidate. You're a candidate who will work for you, not party bosses in Albany. I'm your candidate who will listen, always respectful, always caring. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chanelli. Ms. Lunsford, you have your 1 minute of opening statement. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the League for hosting tonight. I've had the great privilege of representing this district for the last 2 years. And in that time, I delivered on our promise to give this district a seat at the table and secure the funding that we deserve. We delivered on our promise to fully fund our schools. We delivered on our promise to make childcare more affordable to middle-income families, but there's still so much more to do. While we worked hard to put money back in your pockets with property tax rebates and an accelerated middle-class tax cut, we need to do even more to help families make ends meet. We need to fill the pipeline for workers and help parents get back to work. We need to keep our streets and families safe from the scourge of illegal guns. And we need to make sure we're meeting our climate goals responsibly. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to discussing everything that you are interested in tonight. Thank you.
Thank you both for those opening statements. We appreciate them. We're going to jump right into questions, and we're going to start with one of the hottest topics across the country, and that's abortion. So after the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision in a special session, the New York State Legislature passed a bill, S51002-A440002, to amend the state constitution to add new protected classes to the state constitution's existing equal protection clause, which prohibits discrimination based on a person's race, color, creed, ethnicity, race, color, creed, or religion, to bar intentional government discrimination based on a person's ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, or sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy. In order for the amendment to take effect, the incoming legislature would have to pass it, and then it would have to go to the voters. If elected, Mr. Chanelli, will you vote in favor of this bill?
Yes, I would.
Yes. Ms. Lunsford?
Will Mr. Chanelli vote in favor of this bill? Is that my
No,
question?
the same question is posed to you.
I proudly voted for that bill the first time, and I will proudly vote for it again. Every single Republican in the state government voted against that bill, so I'm glad to see that Mr. Chanelli be willing to depart from his party on that issue. It's the first that I've seen of it.
So just a reminder, Ms. Lunsford, let's keep directing anything at Mr. Chanelli. Let's focus on where you stand. So again, this is a forum, so let's focus on where you stand on the issues. We have Mr. Chanelli here, and he'll speak for himself, okay? Deal? Okay, second question is gonna be to start off with you, Ms. Lunsford. In 2019, New York State passed bail reform legislation that ended the use of cash bail in most misdemeanor and nonviolent felony cases. It went into effect at the start of 2020 and underwent some rollback revisions a few months later. There are widely divergent views on the impact of this legislation and whether it should be defended or further limited. So what are your views on the impact of bail reform? And would you support any further rollbacks of the legislation?
So I don't really want to refer to them as rollbacks so much as tweaks as we've seen the bill roll out. I did vote for some changes in the 2022 budget that added some gun crimes to the bail eligible list. I also fought for additional gun crimes and domestic violence crimes to be added, and we did not secure that in this budget. So I would be willing to go back and revisit those issues and hope that we could add a few more gun crimes and domestic violence crimes to the bail eligible list. But what I do want to make sure people understand is that bail is not detention. Bail does not ensure that someone stays behind bars. It means that they will pay money in exchange for release. The 2019 bail reform law did not eliminate the option to hold someone without bail. That never existed in our state. And I hear a lot of rhetoric suggesting that the bail reform law somehow took away a judge's discretion to hold someone without bail, and that's just not what happened. So when we look at the violent crime rates, particularly in the city of Rochester, what we're seeing is the impact of poverty and illegal guns and disinvestment in some of our poorest zip codes. We are not seeing impacts of bail reform. And I think a lot of that language distracts from the reality that we have to deal with a complex, deeply embedded problem that is Rochester specific. You're seeing homicide rates go down in Syracuse. You're seeing homicide rates go down in Buffalo. If this was a statewide law problem, we would see homicide rates up everywhere, but we're not. This is a Rochester problem, and we need to get to the bottom of what exactly is causing that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lunsford. Mr. Chanelli, where do you stand on the impact of the bail reform that went into effect in 2020? And would you support any changes to the legislation? So tell us where you stand, where do you think we are because of it, and what would you do to change it, or is it fine as is?
It's definitely not fine as is, and it's not on its own. It's part of several different legislative changes that took place over the past 2 and 3 years here that have took away the deterrence for violence. And we do have people who are on the streets now who would not have been before the bail reform. It's not simply about bail itself. I can completely agree with that. It's about a dangerous standard. In New York State, we're the only state. There is one other state that is similar, but they have some mechanisms out there. So judges can decide and use their discretion, actually be judges, imagine that, and be able to decide if somebody who has been arrested for a crime, if they're a danger to the community. We're the only state out there that has zero ability for our judges to be able to do that. So our judges are forced to be able to put these people who are dangers, being rearrested numerous times. There is new data out there that's in line with bail reform itself. I think it's broader than bail reform, though, that does show rearrests have gone up significantly. And if you analyze the data specifically in Monroe County, it outpaces the rearrest rates that have taken place in New York City and some of these other places. It's about how the judges apply it. I can certainly go with that, but I'm sorry, I see my time has run out.
Yeah, well, I want to say on crime, because crime is very important to people, and I want to go back to Ms. Lunsford and ask just a follow-up question. So if you're reelected, talk a bit, because it's only a minute and a half, so we got a little bit of time here. So talk a bit more about things that you would do if you're reelected to the state legislature to sort of combat crime in our community. I know you don't represent the city of Rochester, but crime is important to everyone in Monroe County and throughout your district. And there's obviously crime that continues to increase, different crimes beyond murder throughout our community. So talk a bit about what you will do if you're reelected to address crime.
Sure. So while I don't represent the city, I still care very much about the city issues. Our constituents live and work adjacent to and in the city, and there's no such thing as other people's kids. And what we're seeing are young people slaughtered in the streets. One issue that I really deviated from my party with was the less is more bill, which made some changes to the parole violations rules that send people back to jail for parole violations. I voted no on that bill. And I think that we're seeing it bear out in the community, some of the concerns I had that led to me voting no on that bill. I am a co-sponsor on a bill to make some changes to less is more, to make it, to remove the option to apply those exemptions to certain classes of crimes. I think it's important to deal with classes of crimes as opposed to people, because the biases that we get into when we start talking about who's dangerous and who's not, you can see that across the states that do have dangerousness standards, that at a hugely disproportionate rate, young Black men are found to be dangerous versus their white counterparts. But if you talk about the class of crimes, you're dealing with a more objective measure. So I'm supportive of figuring out a way to equitably apply a pretrial detention standard that is linked to a charge as opposed to a person, or perhaps even a cooling off period, which is something that we've been bandying about a little bit. The energy in the assembly against a dangerousness standard is very strong. So we have to figure out a way to meet people halfway to affect the kinds of changes that we need to see. And I think that there's a middle ground to be had in that area.
Thanks so much, Ms. Lunsford. And I just want to give 1 minute to Mr. Chanelli, and I want to ask a follow-up question. Let you finish, because crime is important, and people want to hear from you. If you're elected, if you look at the polls, we don't really see the state legislature flipping parties. So if you're elected, you'll have to work with Democrats. So how would you work, if elected, how would you work with Democrats in Albany to address crime in our community? Let's give them 1 minute to answer that question.
Sure. So the last 20 years, I've been advocating in Washington, D.C., working with the House and the Senate and with the White House. And it didn't matter to me which party they were they represented in there, and I was able to get things done, been reached across the aisle. I have been able to get Republican-led bills through and become U.S. law, and I've certainly more recently been able to find and work with Democrats who they can lead through, including the PACT Act, which was a massive legislation just recently. I'm going to use the same tactics, which is grounding my arguments, my cases in public support and facts, and applying that common sense to my message to them. And I find that people are a lot more reasonable when you treat them reasonably and respectfully. And it works. And, you know, you have to earn their trust. You build these relationships. I'm a relationship specialist when it comes to this. And I have zero problem working across the aisle. And you're absolutely right, Tyrese. It's necessary.
Thanks so much. Mr. Chanelli, we're going to start with you. I just want to remind everybody who's watching, please enter your questions in the Q&A. We have folks watching, so please drop those questions in. Mr. Chanelli, we're going to start with you with this question. The New York Independent Redistricting Commission failed in its mission to create new maps for the House of Representatives, the New York Senate, and the New York Assembly. Would you support changes to redistricting process in New York? And if so, what specific changes would you support?
So I'm actually a fan of the process that we have now. Unfortunately, it wasn't followed, and I'm a fan of it, and I voted for it when it was on the ballot the year prior. We should have this be a nonpartisan procedure. That was not the case. It was also not the case in Monroe County. I know that's not something I'd have effect on, but the commonalities are striking here. We need to get to a point where we have truly nonpartisan procedures there. And obviously the state courts have said that gerrymandering took place in the assembly. In all likelihood, next year's or in the elections in 2 years are going to be new lines. Maybe it affects this district, maybe it doesn't. But we have to stop the gerrymandering. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, when we have one party controlling every aspect of the government, those checks and balances go away. And this is something that occurred because of that.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lunsford, same question to you. Do we need to change the redistricting process in New York? And if so, what changes would you support?
I do want to begin by saying that the assembly maps were not found to be gerrymandered. Gerrymandering was only found to have happened in the congressional lines. The Senate and assembly maps are found to have a procedural error, which is an enormous difference. That procedural error occurred because 2 maps were sent to us and we were never afforded the opportunity to reject a single map the second time. I expressed a lot of concern about this throughout the process. And I think that the way this is set up, it just engenders the same result moving forward because it's not nonpartisan, it's bipartisan, and that's different. These are just agents of both parties working together, and you're always going to have that disagreement. We need to figure out a way to divorce the process from the legislatures, and I don't honestly know a great way to do that, but this clearly doesn't work, and I'm not a fan of this process.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lunsford, I'm going to start with you. We're going to stay sort of in voting. So in 2021, New York State voters opted to not pass measures that would have expanded access to voting by permitting no excuse by mail voting and same-day voter registration. What measures do you support to improve and secure elections and voting for New York State citizens?
So I support both of those measures. We had historically low voter turnout in that election, and I don't think that the rejection of those measures at the poll is a repudiation of those ideas. I'd like to see them revisited in another election and see if voters come out the same way. I hear repeatedly from my constituents that they want mail-in, that they liked having mail-in options during COVID, and it worked really well for people. It greatly increased turnout, and I think that's always the goal. We want to make sure that as many registered voters can vote as possible, and mail-in and same-day voter registration are the best way to do that. I also support a bill that is supported by the New York State Board of Elections and our local Board of Elections to kind of streamline our recount processes. We sped up the way our absentee ballots are counted to make our elections more immediate to the date. There's a lot of ways we can make that more efficient, but the number one thing I push for every single time a voting bill comes up in conference, because I get the ability to have a voice in the majority conference. If we're going to pass requirements that make the BOEs do things, we need to attach funding to that. And too often in Albany, we aren't providing money behind the mandates we're putting on our local governments. I was sat on the local governments committee, and I felt very strongly that our Board of Elections were often left empty-handed at being asked to do Herculean things on shoestring budgets, and that needs to change. And that's something I will continue to fight for in the majority.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chennelly, same question. What measures would you support to improve to secure our elections and voting for all citizens in the state?
First, I'll say I believe our elections are very secure. And I've worked as a poll worker, and I encourage others. I'm part of a national program right now to encourage military veterans to become poll workers wherever they live. Those who have trust issues with our election system, I encourage them to become part of the system so they can see for themselves how secure it is. Regarding vote last year, I'm going to go with what the voters say. The voters voted, they've been heard. I don't want to try to change the rules or try to put it out again. If you support something and you don't get good turnout, that's on you. I am not in favor of putting the same things in front of our voters over and over again until you get the results you want. I think they spoke clearly. The vote wasn't as close as I would want to be able to see. Have to do a revote. I do agree turnout was low, but maybe people just weren't motivated by this, and they do have questions about security.
Thank you very much for your question. So want to go in and talk about, so what are your thoughts on the newly proposed Ethics Commission to replace the JCOPE? And what do you think the commission will be able to do to hold legislators accountable? Mr. Chanelli, let's start with you.
I don't have a lot of faith in it. It's what we have now. Certainly willing to give it a chance. I'll be watching very carefully. Anything better than what we had in the past is, but the corruption that's been in this state for so long and costs New York State taxpayers billions of dollars. I don't believe we have a way right now to truly be able to stop that. Not when we have one party and a very few number of people. It's not everyone in the Democratic Party. Very few number of people really controlling this state, and the checks and balances just do not exist.
Thanks so much. Ms. Lunsford, what do you think about the Ethics Commission? What are we going to do to make sure that we hold legislators accountable?
I'm going to agree with my opponent that truly anything is better than JCOPE. JCOPE was obviously hugely dysfunctional. And when this commission was presented to us, all of us had a lot of questions about who was going to be making these decisions. It is imperfect. And again, I'm also willing to take a look at it, but I think the real way that you hold legislators accountable and you hold our executive accountable is by electing people who support transparency and who support ethics. It took 54 of us signing a letter to get Andrew Cuomo out of office. It took the legislators and a big push from newly elected Democrats who were willing to speak truth to power to say that's not okay. I don't think JCOPE ever would have pushed him out, but we did, because we speak for the people and we did what we needed to do. The struggle that we have is that the people who are referring cases, I think, sometimes fear retribution. We need to figure out a way to remove this from government as much as possible. But again, electing ethical legislators is your best bet for an ethical government.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for your comments on that question. We're going to turn to guns, another hot topic in our state and across our country. So we'll start with you, Ms. Lunsford, with this one. I want to know, what's your opinion on, and you can certainly tell voters how you voted on the new New York State new concealed carry law. I know we all may have saw that a federal judge restricted parts of New York State's law today. So I want to first, let's talk about your thoughts and the importance of New York's new concealed carry law. Where do you stand on it? Tell voters how you voted on the law. And then what do you think today about the restrictions from the federal judge? Do you agree or do you disagree? Go right ahead.
Sure, I'm gonna try to do that in 90 seconds.
I know it's tough to do it. It is.
The Supreme Court really tied our hands. I had no problem with the way our concealed carry law operated before this. It gave us an opportunity to vet why someone was seeking a concealed carry weapon. It had been in operation for 100 years. We had no issues with that. When the Supreme Court took away that option, we were left flat-footed, and we needed to replace it with something, because we need to ensure that the people in our state who are carrying concealed are people who do not mean harm to others. And while you may hear repeatedly that concealed carry owners are not the ones committing crimes, that's not true when you look at domestic violence. 70 women a month are shot by intimate partners, and almost all of them are concealed carry holders. We have people in our own community who have gotten concealed carry permits and who are then committing crimes with them within a month or two. We need to make sure that the people who are accessing weapons are people who want them for positive constitutional reasons. And the inquiry option was taken from us. I'm not going to comment on an ongoing litigation. And I think that the judge in this case, he didn't overturn anything. He issued a temporary restraining order. And I think that was the appropriate thing to do, because whenever you're dealing with a lawsuit around a constitutional right, you should always suspend that law while you figure out if it is constitutional or not. So I think that was the appropriate decision. What that judge ultimately decides, I'm not going to comment on, because I'm going to let the judicial process play out.
I'm an attorney. I like that. Mr. Chanelli, talk about what's your opinion on New York State's new concealed carry law and the limitations and the hold that the federal judge put into place today. Where do you stand? And do you support specifically the restrictions of, we'll answer that question first. What's your opinion on New York State's new concealed carry law and your opinion on the federal judge's decision today?
I think, as has become typical with in Albany, it went too far. It overreached, and they knew going into it that this was going to be declared unconstitutional once again. And they also know it's going to take a while for that to happen. I applaud the judge for at least taking a good look at this. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be years going through different levels of court here before we find out probably what we already know, that they're unconstitutional once again. They're misdirected though. And we had the mayor of Rochester, Malik Evans. We had the sheriff of Monroe County, who's also a Democrat. We had the Rochester police chief, who've all just said in the last week, none of this street violence that's happening right now is being conducted by people with legal guns. It is all with illegal guns. We have to come down much stricter, much tougher on illegal gun users. We need to take all gun crimes off the no bail list, all gun crimes. Instead of going after legal gun owners, we need to get a lot tougher on illegal gun users.
And Mr. Chanelli, just a follow-up question for you. Do you support New York State raising the age to 21 to purchase semi-automatic weapons?
I do not. And we have we continue to raise age on a lot of things, which is interesting itself, but you can enlist in the Army at 17 with parental permission, or on your 18th birthday without any type of permission. And it doesn't always seem to make sense. A lot of what New York State Legislature has done in the last several years now just doesn't pass the common sense test. And this is another one of those.
If elected, and you got 30 seconds left to this, if elected, would you go to Albany? Would you leave the law as so, or would you go and attempt to bring the age back to 18? Where do you stand there?
I would leave the law as it is at 21. I think it's very difficult to go backward in that sense. Much of the other provisions there, I would like to see rolled back, in particular, taking away individual business owners' rights to be able to arm themselves. If you're a restaurant or a bar, some type of establishment in the city of Rochester, and you want to be able to have a personal weapon on you legally, right now, you're not legally able to do that. I think that's ridiculous, and something needs to be rolled back immediately.
Thanks so much for your response. Ms. Lunsford, where do you stand on raising the age and why?
So I voted yes on that bill. And largely in part because of all the data that we now have about brain development in young people, particularly in the consequence forming parts of your brain. It's one of the reasons that we do so much around juvenile justice, because we understand that young people's brains are not fully formed, and the neuroscience that we have shows us that they are maybe not the best decision makers. We saw in Buffalo and we saw in Uvalde 2 18-year-olds who waited until they could legally purchase a semi-automatic weapon before committing a violent act of domestic terrorism. And I think that to say that raising the age doesn't help ignores the fact that both of those mass shooters waited until it was legal to purchase a weapon. You know, everyone is a legal gun owner until the day they're not. No one is a criminal until the day they are. And I think we need to address the situations as they arise.
Thank you both for their responses and for those questions and for your responses for those questions. Let's switch gears and go to education. So Ms. Lunsford, should the state government do more to provide an equitable, quality public education for children pre-K through grade 12? And if so, what should we do?
We certainly should. And one of the things that I ran on in 2020 was fully funding the foundation aid formula, which was came out of a lawsuit in 2008. It's a formula that we use to determine how much state aid our schools should get. That formula was put in place and then never fully funded. Our schools have never received as much money as they should. The city school district is owed over $1 billion at this point from that foundation aid fund. But in 2021, for the very first time, we got a commitment from the governor to fully fund foundation aid over the next 3 years. We increased funding in 21 and in 22 and in 23, I intend to go back to Albany and hold our governor accountable for that promise to make sure that we're fully funded in all of our schools. Every public school in my district received a bump in foundation aid funding as a result of that. We also were able to provide for the first time UPK funding across my district, but UPK is a hugely complicated situation. While we had UPK funding earmarked for our public schools, it was never enough to start a UPK program, particularly because the rates that are set upstate are different than the rates that are set in New York City. And we need parity between the rate setting to ensure that our districts are being reimbursed enough from the state fund to justify starting those programs. This also becomes complicated from a childcare standard, because when you take 3 and 4-year-olds out of childcare, you're offsetting the cost corrector that our childcare is used to keep the cost of care on 0 to 3-year-olds down. So if we do move towards a UPK program, we need to empower our childcare providers to provide those UPK services to ensure that our kids are being properly cared for and properly funded.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chanelli, should the state government do more to provide an equitable, quality public education for children pre-K through grade 12? And if so, what should the government do in Albany?
Absolutely, they should, and schools should be fully funded. And funding is going to need to be increased with the learning loss that our schools across the board have suffered because of the wrong-headed decisions, again, by Albany, closing the schools statewide. I know hindsight is what it is, but what this really was another move of overreach by our state, making applying a one-size-fits-all fix in closing schools, including some of the schools in our district that didn't need to necessarily close. When those types of decisions are made, they need to be made by the local school boards, the local boards of education and their superintendents. We should not be telling from Albany school whether they can stay open or not.
Thank you both. So want to stay on education for a bit and also sort of touch at the same time. So this is a question we just got in from the public. So do you see a difference between, and Mr. Chanelli, we'll start with you for this question. Do you see a difference between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching? And if so, what are you doing to help voters understand the difference to better support teachers? And just the caveat, so we all know critical race theory is not taught in public education. So I love to put that caveat out there. So go right ahead and try to answer that question from the public.
Yes, I'm not one to define either. I look at it with the curriculum, and the curriculum is focused on factual history, not whitewashing history, and I have a great appreciation for that. Focusing on respect and acceptance and cultural understanding. I have no problem with these things, and I talk with hopefully future constituents all the time on this, and I'm able to pull out exactly what's really being taught in our schools, and through the curriculum at least, and talk about how reasonable they actually are.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lunsford, same question for you. Do you see a difference between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching? And if so, what would you do to help voters understand the difference to better support our teachers?
So I spend time helping constituents understand this every day. And the difference is that culturally responsive teaching is a technique employed by our teachers, and critical race theory is a made-up buzzword to freak people out. It is a phrase that's used by people to ensure that people are fighting against what some people view, and I don't think the majority of people view, as the villainization of one race in our schools. And we all know that that's not happening. Those types of ideas were put forth in school board elections up and down my district, and they were repudiated across the board. Any person running for school board trying to run on a fear-mongering campaign around critical race theory lost their races spectacularly. And I think that the voters in our district, for the most part, understand that culturally responsive teaching is something we use to help our students learn in the way that's best for them, meeting students where they are and ensuring that they have the tools they need to flourish in our schools. You're muted.
I should unmute. Thank you so much for your answer. Staying in education, going back to you, Mr. Chanelli, your campaign platform talks about one of your platforms says keeping politics out of the classroom. Explain to voters what that means.
Sure. Politics is divisive. And it's something that really needs to stay away from what should be a comfortable learning environment. And whether that is talking specifically about candidates and parties, the high school that one of my children go to right now, they said no one should be wearing specific, he pointed out, the principal pointed out a specific party and said, no one should be wearing shirts that say these things. And, it's not conducive for the environment that they want. And I support that, even though the party he said was the party that I'm running, that line I'm running on. I don't have a problem with that. It's gone too far in some ways with some movements, political movements. I think there's a fine line between something becoming a political movement and something being maybe a human rights movement. I can be fully supportive of the human rights movement, but when it becomes political, when it becomes divisive to the point that students are focusing on that or becoming defensive and not being able to focus on receiving the education they need, that's when it really becomes a problem. And I talk with parents just about every day, I would say every day, about this. And sometimes we have to talk through what's really being taught, what's really being done, what's really being allowed, and what's not, and what's the perception on that. And I think that's part of my job. But there are times where I find things that are not appropriate, and I address those with the school system.
Thank you so much. And 1 minute for you, Ms. Lunsford. Do you see an issue with politics in our classroom? If you do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? And if not, how do you embody sort of what we see now with this political spirit throughout just all levels of education?
Politics is in everything we do. It's how our schools are funded. How do you teach US history without teaching politics? How do you teach literature without teaching politics? And schools are places for kids to learn to think critically, to disagree respectfully, and to argue persuasively. And if you don't teach those skills in school, if you don't figure out a way to help people work through complex topics and figure out difficult political ideas with guidance, you end up, I think, with the division we have in our broader community. I think the silencing of political voices is part of how we ended up with the vitriol we have in our broader community. People need to learn to have conversations where they disagree, because 9 times out of 10, we agree about the goal, but we disagree about how we get there. And we call that politics, but schools where you learn how to do that. And I think that keeping politics out of our schools is a simplistic and short-sighted view.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chanelli, question for you. We talk about, and Ms. Lunsford used the phrase difficult conversations. So let's talk about going back to, you talked a bit about curriculum, and you gave the example of your son's principal. Should in public education, should teachers be talking about these difficult issues such as race, redlining, climate change, issues that we as adults sort of are hot button topics? Should we be discussing those issues in our public K through 12 education as topics as we see difficult?
So I'm glad you mentioned K through 12. So it
Yep.
needs to be age appropriate. I don't think some of these, if you're talking about a way that you can particularly help in an issue, if we're talking about, recycling, or if we're talking about being a good steward of our environment, those things can be more appropriate for younger ages. When we're talking, it needs to be it needs to be age appropriate is the bottom line on that. But difficult conversations, yes, at the right age, they should be there. They should be guided. They should be structured. And, teachers are very influential on students, and that's great. I completely understand why teachers were very influential on me, and I'm grateful for them. But if they are going too far in trying to persuade their students, it's no longer, level ground there, so to speak. They're going to be able to persuade students, and maybe it's not something that's in line with that family's values.
I again have to unmute. So I'm going to, I want to get just 2 more questions in. And I know they gave me a time, but it's 2 important questions I want to try to get in. And it's about, I want to stay sort of in education quickly. Ms. Lunsford, question for you. Let's talk about safety in the classroom. There's topics going around. How do we keep our kids safe in our classroom? There's talks in some states. I mean, you just saw in Oklahoma, they're talking about arming teachers. How do we keep our students safe in schools, and do you support arming teachers?
I absolutely do not support arming teachers. I was an attorney in this district for 11 years, and part of what I did was cases involving the city school district. I was also heavily involved in our teen court, where I saw a lot of disputes, particularly out of the city school district. And I truly believe 2 things. If you arm teachers, a kid's going to get a hold of that gun. It's only a matter of time. If you have guns in our schools that are held by people who are not law enforcement officers, kids are going to get a hold of them. And secondly, we have seen time and time again that your average person does not respond well in an emergency. You looked at Uvalde, where you had law enforcement officers, and even they were unable to respond. I have seen teachers who are trained in using defibrillators, unable to respond to a medical emergency because they just had a panic. And I don't trust teachers. Perhaps if someone had military training and could make a very compelling case that they were particularly well suited, maybe I would be supportive of that. But in general, I do not support arming teachers. We have to take the illegal guns off our streets and ensure that the people who are getting access to guns don't mean people harm. We need to address the mental health crises that lead to our school shootings. We need to have a better idea of what's going on with our students and ensure that their mental health needs are being met, because too many times school shootings are being committed by students of that school for whom there were red flags. We were able to expand our red flag laws here in this state last year, and I voted yes on that bill, to give healthcare practitioners the option to file ERAPs, to ensure that we can get a handle on students who are posing a risk. And I think that's the best way to deal with violence in our schools.
Thank you so much. 1 minute response for you, Mr. Chanelli. How do we keep our kids safe in school? Particularly, I want to clarify our kids in K through 12. How do we keep our kids safe in school, and do you support arming teachers?
First, I believe this needs to be a focus in funding in the coming year, improving our school safety for sure. As usual, we have Albany here telling our school systems what they can and can't do. I think that this should be a decision that's made at the local school level, and I'm sorry, not the school level, the school board level, the boards of education. I'd be very surprised if any of the boards of education in our district would allow it. But I do think there are school systems out there who, in certain areas of the state, if they have people who are trained in, I think it'd be okay to, at the very least, have a minimum training requirement. I agree that you need to be very specially trained to be armed in a school, but I don't think that the state should keep telling the school systems what they can and cannot do.
Thank you so much. So this is our last question of the night, and it's an important question. And we'll start with you, Mr. Chanelli. If you are elected to the New York State Assembly, what would be your first priority on day one in Albany? And how will you go about accomplishing that number one priority you have? And how do you get it passed as law?
Understood. First priority right now has to be public safety. And there's nothing more important in this state right now than setting and establishing a dangerousness standard. I would go to Albany immediately and start working with those people out there who need to be convinced, need to understand the common sense end behind here. Yeah, I think I can be very persuasive. I know how to make the proper case here, and showing that we are the only state in the nation that does not allow our judges to truly be judges. That really has to be our first point here. Sorry, I've lost the screen. Got you back.
Yep. Okay, great. Were you all set, or did you want to finish? You're good?
I'm set. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lunsford, your last question of the night. If you are reelected, what's your top priority if you're going back to Albany? How are you going to accomplish it? How are you going to get it passed as law? Top priority on day one.
Our families are still suffering. We're still digging our way out of COVID. We have workforce development problems and parents who are still not back to work. And we need to figure out ways to help families make their ends meet. We were able to do a lot in the budget to help put money back in people's pockets, like with a property tax rebate and middle class tax cut, but we need to do more. I hold a bill right now to expand the child independent care tax credit so that families that have kids in daycare, or especially multiple kids in daycare, can get a meaningful tax return to help pay for that. Because right now our entire economy is suffering because we have 1987 levels of women's participation in the workforce. Women left the workforce during COVID and they haven't come back. We need to bring them back in. We need to bring working parents back into our workforce so we can repopulate the workforce in our nursing homes, in our daycare centers, in our hospitals, in our restaurants. Because the reality is women do that work. The service industry collapsed because women left the workforce. If we're going to rebuild our economy to post-COVID levels, we need to get women back to work.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to closing statements from both candidates, and we will start off again in alphabetical order. So closing statements, you will start, Mr. Chanelli. Go right ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for holding this tonight and for taking your time to learn more about your candidates here. I want you to make an informed decision, and I greatly respect that you're taking the time to do that. My pledge to you is simple. I'm always going to listen to you. I'm always going to respect you, and I'm always going to put our community first. Nationwide inflation is supercharged in New York State because of bad policies, regulations that go too far, mandates that are being pushed too fast. Criminal justice reform has failed. Everyone can plainly see that every day. Yet our state assembly won't address it, pretending there are bigger issues than innocent lives snuffed out by career criminals who should be in prison. When you make your decision at the ballot box in a few weeks, please consider what type of community you want to live in. If you want a state that holds criminals accountable, deterring violent crime, vote for me. If you want a state that's friendly to small businesses, vote for me. If you want a state government that stays in its lane, vote for me. If you want a representative who works for you, please vote for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We appreciate it, Mr. Chanelli. Ms. Lunsford, go right ahead with your closing statements.
So I also want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate in government. It's hugely important. And I promise you that if reelected, I will go back to Albany and I will do what I've been doing, which is making sure that our district gets a seat at the table. The reality is that the majority and minority are hugely disproportionate in the assembly. And if you're going to get anything done, if you're going to secure funding, if you're going to pass bills, if you're going to have an impact, you need representation in the majority. The prior person to hold this seat for 10 years was in the minority and never got anywhere near the funding I was able to secure for this district. Passed 5 bills in 10 years. I passed 17 bills in 2 years. I secured $4 million for this district. I funded our firehouses, our nursing homes, our schools. I'm rebuilding sewer systems and streams and ensuring that we have the infrastructure that we need to harden ourselves against climate change. We have a seat at the table because I get to be your voice. I get to sit inside the rooms where the decisions are happening. And if you want to make sure that your voice can be heard in Albany, I ask you please to trust me again to be that voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. I want to personally thank both of you. This was fun for me to hear from both of you. And I hope the voters listening in enjoyed tonight. Thank you both for being respectful to one another and for sharing your perspectives and your point of views. We want to thank our candidates for discussing the issues tonight. We want to thank all the attendees who joined us this evening. And with that, I will turn it back over to Barbara. Barbara, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Tyrese, and thank you, Tess, for super timekeeping, and thank both our candidates very much. So I can give you some reminders, you voters. So you have 3 ways to vote. You can vote absentee. If you want to do that, you need to apply for your absentee ballot in advance. Applications are available now. Can be filed now. You should contact the Board of Elections or look on their website to get the details. Second, you can early vote if you'd like to. Early voting begins on October 29th. You can vote in any early voting site in New York, in Monroe County, and they are spread all over the county. And then finally, on election day, November 8th, you can vote at your assigned polling location. And I'm going to urge everyone to double check their location, because I keep hearing stories that locations have changed for some people. I think it's part of the redistricting. So you can, again, do that on the Monroe County Board of Elections website or at vote411.org. I have to mention that and put in a plug. Vote411.org is where you can find everyone who's going to be on your ballot in all the different races, including judicial races and assembly and senate and the statewide races. And there is also one ballot measure that we'll all need to vote on, and you should read up on that too. And you can see that on Vote411 as well. So thank you all for coming. We will be posting this very soon on our website, and we'll send you all a message when we do that. Tell your friends about this very worthwhile debate. It's one of the best I've seen in a long time. So even though we didn't have the 100 people we would have liked to have to hear you tonight, there's still a chance for lots of people to hear you. So thank you again to our candidates. You were both just everything we hope to see in candidates. One thing was that you were here and you stayed on topic and you were respectful, and we love you both. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.